record here. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Greeb, and welcome to my brief talk on one of my favorite subjects, photography. Today, we'll be discussing Rising Towards Beauty, a visual storytelling rooted in faith. As you might imagine, there are quite a few things to discuss on this topic. So, of course, after our introduction, we're going to talk a bit about the purpose of photography and following that right up with principles of storytelling, and then looking at the actual skills necessary for strong photos, like subject matter, composition, lighting. And then we're going to return back to theory, looking at all of this through a biblical Christian lens. Once we pull all those threads together, we're going to look ahead to application and what is next for taking photos that reflect the good, true, and beautiful, and how that pertains to education and culture. So before we get into that, I think a brief word of introduction would be helpful. I'm a recent homeschool graduate and current college student. Since I was homeschooled for my entire life, I have always kind of been blessed to kind of explore some of my different interests, and one of them was photography. I still remember being about 6 years old and running around the house with a little point and shoot camera, taking random pictures of my dolls or the cats. And that kind of just continued really throughout my kind of through middle school, high school. In high school, I kind of got more serious about it and did an online photography class and some online design classes. And then I kind of dropped off a bit. I got busy with other things in college. And then it wasn't until about a little over a year and a half ago that I kind of rediscovered just what photography was, and further how I could use it to bless other people. So it kind of it sparked this new love for taking photos of people that reflected who they were. And so that's kind of where I am today. I'm also teaching now as I work through toward a college degree. And so we'll be, from that perspective, kind of talking about some of these kind of important principles of photography. So purpose of photography, of course, as you might have known if you've had maybe a little bit of Greek, photography, when we break that down, is literally kind of drawing or writing with light. Phos meaning light. And graphe, think of like graphite in your pencil, or graphics, as a kind of like a writing and a drawing. And oftentimes when we talk about the purpose of photography, we are capturing moments or memories, kind of, getting the family picture, or even doing self-expression. And that's kind of and with that being our understanding, we also are finding that cameras are just ubiquitous. They are everywhere now. They're phone cameras, DSLR cameras, point and shoots. We can have even multiple cameras in a single room of our house. And so there's a reason why that matters, because according to the vice president of Google, I think about 2 years ago, he said that today more than 4 trillion photos are stored in Google Photos. And every week, 28 billion new photos and videos are uploaded. On a kind of similar statistic, actually back almost 10 years ago now, Benedict Evans had predicted that the number of photos taken in that year alone would probably be more than the 150 years of film photography before. And as all this is going on, as you are probably aware, our culture is becoming more visually oriented. Looking at photos on social media, Instagram or Facebook, kind of the people's great desire for more and more selfies. Those are on the rise. And now we have AI-generated images also coming onto the scene with a host of potential ethical queries and questions about the future of visual arts. So with all that said, I think it's important that we extend photography beyond just self-expression, even though that's a part of it, and that is, I think, and even important as well. But photography is a form of communication. The saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. That's kind of the new currency, so to speak, in our age. And even throughout history, photography has been a critical tool for capturing events or having a call for action. So on this page, I have a couple more famous photos. Dorothea Lange, who was known for some of her photos during the Great Depression, as photojournalism. And an older photo as well from 1911 on the right from Lewis Hines, who's one of the muckrakers during an era of American reform. For example, muckrakers was also the time when we saw more food label laws come to existence during kind of the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt. So laws against child labor, as we can see in this photo. And for Christians, this also extends to a call to reflect the creation and impact culture. And we're going to talk about that more in a minute. Before we get there, we're also going to talk about the other key component of getting photos that communicate these important messages. And that is through storytelling. People love stories, and they always have. And images are a critical part of that process. I mean, C.S. Lewis recounts in a very short essay that the Chronicles of Narnia began with this image that he had in his mind when he was 16. And so there's this connection between images, imagination, and storytelling. And there are so many ways that we can tell stories. It can be an arranged scene, as our photo with the kittens here on the top right, carefully staged before it's photographed. Or it could be more spontaneous, like this cat out on the street on the bottom right. It could be one photo, as these two are, or it could be a sequence, as is the photo on the left. Part of the reason these are all cats and all black and white is to kind of show that range of possibility. All of these tell some sort of story. The story with the kittens and their birthday cake might be a little more obvious. Oh, clearly kittens are having a birthday. But these other pictures are also telling something about the environment. There are things going around these cats. There's a context to them. And that is something compelling for us viewers to look at. Storytelling, then, as we've just talked about, it requires thinking about photos as communication. And so the things that we're going to be discussing in a few minutes, probably a minute, are basically like these stylistic components that will alter or contribute like to how you tell that story. And essentially our goal is just to be intentional about what the message is. What are we trying to communicate visually with our photos? Even if we're more casual photographers photographing a family dinner or getting the newest portrait or, taking photos while on vacation, to looking at it more seriously from a lens of entrepreneurship or starting a small business. Having strong stories in photos is a way to bless and serve others around us, as well as be intentional in a culture that is just pushing images of all sorts of quality upon us. So with all that said, let's talk about more of the practical skills that are really important to have cemented when it comes to taking photos. So first of all, of course, you want to have a clear subject. Our photo here on the left, our orange cat, we can clearly tell that is the subject. It's kind of a no-brainer, but sometimes it can be harder or easy to forget, as I have found, to be very intentional as I'm taking the photo and ask, okay, what is my subject? What's the main focal point of this photo? Where will my viewers' eyes be drawn? An important principle really in design in general is that people are drawn to eyes. So when we have like a cat, someone looking toward the camera, that's where people naturally look as well. But besides just having a clear subject, we also want to think about everything around our photo. So this very old photo of Abraham Lincoln is a nice example of having kind of our subject, which is of course Abraham Lincoln in his very dapper hat, our foreground, which is just grass, not overly exciting, and a very interesting background that, while somewhat detailed, is still not necessarily distracting from the scene that we're looking at. And so everything fits together into a cohesive photo. So thinking about both the subject and also thinking about how the foreground, the trees in this instance, the background which is our trees, our foreground, which is our kind of textured grass, and our kind of middle ground, where the subject often is, are two very important things to be intentional when we consider. Next, also as important, is this issue of compositions, and we have some options. Again, we have Dorothea Lange over here with a very centered photo. Even though it's centered, however, there is still a certain dynamism to it, and it's also balanced with a child on each side. And your eyes are probably drawn to her eyes as well. And so it has a balanced feel. It keeps our attention focused on the woman and just her kind of her story that she's telling. Meanwhile, photo on the right is more rule of thirds that we can see if we draw our grid lines through it. We kind of look toward his eyes again, and they fall near a crossroad. I cannot remember the proper word for an intersection of these lines in our thirds. And so as the website Digital Photography School talks about, when you use a rule of thirds, you have a balance going on. You have this kind of harmony and of course dynamism. There is a sense of movement from putting this in the rule of thirds as we're watching the flower he's dumping in his bowl here. And so there is some movement toward it. We're looking at what he's looking at. And so in this instance, the rule of thirds helps tell us the story about this person in his pastry shop. So thinking about, like, do I want this picture to be centered? Do I want it to be rule of thirds? Is also going to slightly alter the story. And thinking about the idea of balance and movement and even dynamism are important to consider as well. Of course, there's more about composition though, and that is how close we are to our subject matter. So over here in the photo of our saddle maker in Montana, we have a very up close kind of shot. Really the focus is kind of on his hands, but we can see what he's working on as well. While if we have more space around our subject, as in this photo, it gives just a different effect. I think in many ways, all these different boxes and backgrounds contribute to the story of where this cat is sitting. And again, actually, we do see some kind of rough rule of thirds going on as well, just as in our structuring device. Those are the two kind of key components of composition. But of course, since we already talked about how photography is drawing with light, so we have talked about lighting. And one thing that's helpful with black and white photographs is that it's clearer to tell just what the light is doing. Sometimes colors, well, they're very important, and we could talk for a long time about those and just color theory. They're assessing the quality of light and its direction, and I'm using shadow intentionally is very clear from black and white. So for example, we have light and contrast and just the quality of light coming through this grate on the left. And the very high contrast of the whites and the blacks makes that a visually interesting photograph. Because contrast is critical for a strong story as well. The photo in the middle is also from Lewis Hines. Interestingly, because you can also see the photographer with his camera in the shadow. And so it's just kind of more of a different kind of way of thinking about using shadow. In many ways, it seems to add to the picture that we have the cameraman in it. However, we don't always want to have lots of shadows or very dramatic high contrast light, as in Abraham Lincoln. When you're doing portraits, for example, family pictures, even like vacation pictures, often a soft, more diffused light helps your subject to kind of really capture them without kind of distorting their features or masking them in deep shadow. Again, so kind of the key word is kind of intentionality and thinking about these qualities of light, how harsh it is versus how soft it is, and matching that to its proper subject so as to best portray it. So then, that's our really quick crash course in those basics of key photography principles. Now let's expand a bit into Christian photography in general. As we've already talked about, just from the sheer staggering statistics, we are in a photo-saturated culture. Neil Postman, in Amusing Ourselves to Death, makes a very important point that all of this new imagery that we have with photography at its forefront isn't merely just supplementing language, like our written discourse in particular, and spoken, but it's replacing it as our dominant means for construing, understanding, and testing reality. That means that now more than ever, there is a need and burden for taking photos that have a proper understanding of reality. And that's where this idea of culture comes in with this great quote from Ken Myers in a Gospel Coalition article called "What is Culture?" Essentially, he says that culture is what we make with creation. So everything, including fine art and therefore photography, is manufactured with the stuff of creation. And what we bring together are expressions of what we make of that creation with our value system. And so they contain and convey assumptions at what kind of beings we think we are and what we believe about the world we inhabit. And so this gives us basically a standard to evaluate the forms, both other photos that we see and our own photos as we think about them. Do they represent well the kinds of creatures we are and the kind of world in which God has placed us? That is both an excellent question for when we look at the barrage of images that hit us every day, but also for just for thinking about the photos that we take and what they communicate. And so, as we've kind of already talked about, there is, I think, a very clear goal for photography that we can use these skills like of composition and lighting to tell these intentional stories that reflect what is true about creation and about the creator, and to pass on a culture that values these biblical principles. It may not be as obvious as writing it out in an essay or in a treatise, but the visual images stick with people and bless other people by showing them that different view of the world. And so I really like this poem from Gerard Manley Hopkins, where he just says that the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. And I think viewing our world, the creation around us, with that photographic lens and recognizing the grandeur and the glory that it is charged with is something to carry with us when we do photography. So time is kind of running a bit low, so we're just going to briefly go through some photos. You can kind of see some different uses of light or conveying personality. In this photo of an itinerant pioneer of the Ozarks, the way this photo is taken, there's such a sense of his personality that's showing something about creation, the image of God in each person, and how unique that can be. Again, we have Lewis Hines again communicating about child labor and cotton mills. And we have my own photo, which was a portrait that I took for one of my professors. And again, kind of trying to capture that sense of the person who's creating the image of God and to reflect who they are accurately. And then landscapes or close-up shots of nature also can reflect the creation. And so that kind of leads us to like, what's next? I think throughout this, the goal is for Christians to, and for as educators as well, to be intentional and thoughtful in how we look at photos around us and take photos. And we can love those around us by recording memories, however minute or grand they may be. And we can kind of counter through this obsession that our culture has with the self and the selfie and extend that to a more general love of neighbor. And of course, we can highlight the beauty of creation in a world where it often seems like it's increasingly chaotic and saturated with images that just aren't beautiful. And thinking about what is beautiful and good and true. And so by using kind of some of these principles like lighting, which can shift how we tell our story, what is around our story, what the context of the story we're communicating is, we're sharing about what's good, true, and beautiful. So kind of what we've talked about is a brief foundation for a Christian and biblical understanding of photography. With this as our roots, then let us rise to use storytelling to inform those around us about the creation, its creator, and the relationship that he wants to have with us, his creation, through sending his son to die for us. So I just wanted to briefly share further resources. So far, I have found Adobe Creative Cloud's photography section to be really helpful in just having really direct articles. And when it comes to looking for photos, I do really like My Modern Met, which has some really lovely landscapes often. But unfortunately, because it's photography and art, they aren't always virtuous. So that is a call for discretion as well when looking through images to find examples that are worthy to be praised and avoiding those that are would not necessarily align to the standard for Christian photography we've laid out. So thank you so much for your listening and attendance, and go out there and consider how to use the visual arts to share the good, true, and beautiful with those around you.